I'm happy to welcome George Roeder, expert in residence at Rippleworks, and Tyler Radford, executive director at Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. George and Tyler?
Great stuff. I guess I am on. Really wonderful to be with all of you today and to spend some time with this humanitarian OpenStreetMap movement and the HOT organization and share some thoughts on that I think are relevant to where this organization and where this movement is at right now. The growth opportunity that is in front of you, the growth that is in front of you over the years ahead. And I want to just share sort of some experience that I've had in other open organizations and movements, and just kind of talk through, in particular, some of the things that I notice around the tensions that are likely to emerge or probably have already emerged over the next few years, and how to hold those tensions. A little bit of background on me. I spent my only 20 years of my career, the last 20 years, working for a number of different open organizations. The first was co-founding Engineers Without Borders in Canada, and then went on to work for Mozilla. And then now I'm spending a bunch of time consulting with a variety of organizations, including have had the opportunity to spend some time with HOT. And through sort of this experience, I've certainly noticed a bunch of trends that I want to talk about sort of at these different inflection points. Before I dig into that, I am coming to you from Canada. I'm in Toronto right now. And some of you might know that Canada has a bit of a troubled past, troubled history with the Indigenous peoples who were on this land before anybody who was European descent arrived. And one of the things that this country is doing right now is going through a long and tricky process of reconciliation with that past. And one of the things that we tend to, that we've started to incorporate into public events is recognition that people were here before Europeans arrived. And they have a deep and important connection to the land, and that land was likely unjustly taken from them in some way or another. And so I just want to, now that we have this global community here, bring some of that Canadian reconciliation into this room, and just say, you know, the land that I'm on right now, and I acknowledge is land that was part of many people's history before Europeans arrived, and they still are on this land, and as are we, and we work together in trying to reconcile that. So with that said, if you'll permit me to kind of dig into a bit of a, or not dig in actually, if you permit me to kind of tell a little bit of an anecdote to start off, that's a bit personal. Last night at around 4 in the morning, 4:20 to be exact, my 6-year-old daughter kind of crawled into bed with my wife and I. Went between the sheets and then basically started and proceeded to continue kicking for most of the next 2 hours, which meant that I was up at 4:20 this morning. And it gave me some good opportunity to reflect a little bit on the theme of the talk today, holding tensions and how and what growth is and some of those things. And actually, one of the funny thoughts that came to my mind around tensions was related to my daughter. And I was thinking back to when my wife and I were deciding, how we wanted to raise her, what was the philosophy that we were going to use. And we'd read a lot of different methods, and there's sort of two contrasting sides, I would say, at the extremes. On one end, there's attachment parenting, where you try to really engage in high touch and really always be there for your kids. And then on the other side, there's this Ferber method, which, many of you probably have heard of, like, let them cry, they'll work it out, just let them cry it out. At 5 a.m. when my daughter still, jumps into bed with us on a regular basis, I was thinking to myself that as we sort of looked and engaged with those tensions, we made a choice, and we made the choice in one very strong direction of attachment parenting. And I'm still paying for it 5 years later, not having the strength to, occasionally be in that mode of crying it out. And I tell that story because I think as any organization, as any organization grows, and in this case, as my daughter grows, you're going to have these various tensions, these two sides that will emerge. And I think the natural tendency is to choose one option over the other. And the reason that there's a natural tendency to choose is, my observation is that it's a lot harder to not choose. It's a lot harder to hold both sides of the tension at the same time and allow them both to exist within the organization, to operate almost as in two modes at once. And so organizations tend to choose. What I've discovered and believe is that in open organizations, choosing can actually be wrong. And choosing can send you down a path where you start to become something you don't want to become, and start to become something that's less powerful, less transformative, less amazing than what you could become otherwise, if you actually just held those two tensions together. And so I wanted to just present briefly 3 tensions to consider over these next years as the humanitarian OpenStreetMap movement and community evolve, as HOT evolves, that I think will probably face this movement and this organization, and that I think will be important to kind of hold these things in tension rather than resolve them one way or the other. So the first tension that I have felt in organizations is this tension between control and chaos. When you're in startup mode, and especially in open communities, there really is this beautiful chaos that emerges. Ideas come from everywhere. It's somewhat ad hoc. I just heard in that last talk, some of this really is very emergent, and it's beautiful. And at some point, organizations get to a point, and even movements get to a point where everybody says, whoa, 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 this chaos is a lot. We need to add some controls in place. We need to add some structures in place. We need to batten down the hatches. And at these moments, oftentimes what happens is that the needle gets pushed too far to the side of control, and you lose some of that beautiful chaos. And where I experienced this really was in starting Engineers Without Borders. And it was about 8 years in when we had this similar founding story, and there's this beautiful chaos, and it resulted in a lot of value being created for a lot of people, and the organization growing and starting to actually evolve it very much into a movement. And it was all driven by this bottom-up energy and ideas from everywhere. And at that moment, we had this choice of really kind of what is the strategy that we're moving forward on. And so we sat down as a small executive team in a room, and we started doing what the executive teams do: writing a mission statement, writing a new vision, writing a strategy. And we got pretty far down the line. And I remember one of the folks in the room, she said, hey, there's something about this that doesn't feel right. This feels really controlling versus sort of allowing sort of this emergence to happen, and finding this kind of middle way of between needing to have more of a strategy, but still allowing that emergence from the bottom. And so at the equivalent of a HOT summit that year, we stood up on stage with our old mission statement, and I did this. I burned the old mission statement in front of everyone. I have a bit of a flair for the dramatic, and I remember doing this. I remember looking down at my board chair, who I didn't tell I was going to do this before I did that, and thinking, oh my gosh, I'm about to get myself fired. But at the same time, really sort of told the room, hey, we are mission statementless. And we don't have another one sitting under this podium that I'm going to pull out and email out to everybody. Instead, what we're doing is we're challenging this group, we're challenging this room to use the amazing ideas that are here and to eventually land in a few months on a clarified set of values and a clarified vision and a clarified strategy that would come from the bottom and eventually be synthesized. And so it wasn't that we were getting rid of the idea of control, that we were getting rid of the idea of having some standards and some direction and that type of thing. It was just that we were opening the principle that as that emerged, it should still emerge from the beautiful chaos that exists within open organizations. So this tension between control and chaos, I think, is one to navigate and hold. The second tension I wanted to talk about is this tension between scale and depth. And oftentimes within any organizations, it's really on the scale side, it's first of all, the big numbers that get noticed and that everybody talks about. And so there's really a bias toward valuing scale and talking about scale, and anybody who's achieving it it really gets kind of put on a podium. And at the same time, on the scale side, the reality is if you're doing good work, you should try to do more of it and as much of it as possible. In this community's case, mapping an area home to 1 billion people is an incredible goal and is a meaningful scale that really moves the needle in the world. And at the same time, in these organizations, as you move towards scale, oftentimes there's a feeling that depth or quality or discernment or nuance get lost along the way. And it really requires figuring out how do you hold both of those at the same time. A brief example is one of my experiences at Mozilla. It's an amazing project that I was helping to lead called Common Voice, which was a project to really mobilize volunteers around the world to contribute their voices in small snippets to an open corpus of voice data that would be used to train automatic speech recognition engines that could be open source. And this is incredibly powerful. It allows communities, languages to get speech recognition that they wouldn't otherwise. It allows communities and companies to be able to build tools that aren't necessarily going to be provided by Amazon or Google, and really can be quite powerful. To give a quick example for one instance, the language in Rwanda, Kenyan Rwandan, now has enough data to build an automatic speech recognition engine for Kenyan Rwandan, which never would have happened or been prioritized by Google and Amazon for commercial purposes, which is completely understandable. But now that community can take control and do some really amazing things and imagine all sorts of implementations that use that technology. And so we put out this project and mobilized hundreds of thousands of volunteer contributors to it. And really that was what everybody got very excited about and what got the most attention. How many thousands of hours, how many hundreds of thousands of contributors. And it's internally what the organization was really driving towards. And at the same time, as we scaled, there was a depth that started emerging around linguistics and around technology. And could have been pretty easy actually to ignore that and just say, hey, we're simplifying down. We're going to ignore accents and dialects. We're going to ignore sub-languages. We're going to ignore locations. And that would have been able to attract the same number of resources. But instead, as a team, what we did was we held these two tensions. We said, yes, we absolutely need to achieve meaningful scale so that communities are going to be able to offer and build really powerful technologies. And at the same point in time, we need to respect that there's a depth to language and there's a depth to data, and the quality and the qualities of it ought to be respected. And so, we have, if you look at the Common Voice project, there's these long threads on, individual languages and areas. And, as many of you have been part of open communities, you know that they are mostly respectful and sometimes not, but are real. There's depth there, and this project was successfully able to hold that tension between depth and scale. Didn't need to make a choice, but instead sort of held that tension between those things, and is much more powerful because of it. The final tension is this tension between complex and simple. And it's a little bit different than what I've been talking about, in the sense that oftentimes as movements and organizations proceed, there's definitely a desire to simplify the model and simplify the strategy, to make choice. Are we at this organization, or are we that? Are we at this movement, or are we at that movement? And even sort of thinking about who is part of things, there's a tendency to want to simplify. Or in some cases, there's a tendency to say, like, we are going to just make sure we are taking the richness of the complexity of this, and we're not going to lose any of it. I think both of those choices, what I've observed, either simplifying too much or being too complex, can actually paralyze an organization and prevent it from having the type of impact that it can. And so another story from Mozilla really is around this notion of community. Organizations and communities and movements grow sort of from the bottom up. And then, you turn around and a few years later, you want to try to optimize it and manage it and help grow it. And you start to rationalize, you start to try and figure out what's there. And Mozilla's first kind of attempt at this was to say, well, who is this Mozilla community? And this is sort of from the 2013, 2012. There was this desire to kind of really simplify it down to these kind of 5 categories, and everybody fit into one of these 5 categories. And this was the driving mental model of Mozilla and the community for a while. And the simplification resulted in addition to being a little bit quite inaccurate, what it did was it resulted in all sorts of shorthands. What does the community think? How does the community going to react to this? How can we get information from the community? And when I arrived in 2014, 2015, what I realized was that this mental model had pervaded and was really stopping the organization from seeing the richness that existed within all of these people who were contributing to the various different projects that were part of Mozilla, or that Mozilla had involvement in. And so we undertook a project to really think about this mental model and question it and come up with something pretty radically different, frankly. And it wasn't to get rid of all of the simplicity, but it was to also capture some of the complexity that existed. And sort of one of the big mental leaps we made was saying, Mozilla isn't a community. There is no Mozilla community. There are many communities that are part of this broader movement that Mozilla is catalyzing around the open web and around software around the open web. And we can actually map out those different communities. And we can map out the individuals that are in them. And we can map out the interactions between those individuals and where they cross over and are part of multiple different communities. And we can start to see in this complexity the richness, and we can start to ask questions we weren't able to otherwise ask. Why is there this cluster of people around Firefox and contributing to Firefox, and a totally different cluster contributing to the back-end engine, web rendering engine, Gecko? And who are these people that are part of both of these communities? And what role do they play in advancing the software and the state of the art of the software? And how do we empower each of them? And this complexity allowed us to still hold on to this concept of core contributor and the next layer down, but allowed us to then apply that simplicity to these different communities and ask questions. How can we best support? How can we best advance? And how can each of these individual communities best move themselves forward? And how do they behave together in this broader network, in this broader movement, in a really powerful way to have a different level of impact that would not have been possible? And so it was this combination, this holding of both simplicity and complexity that allowed us to really start to realize some amazing things and start to advance the notion of communities and the notion of openness within Mozilla once again. So those are kind of three tensions to consider. I hope some of them are resonant and that you're thinking a little bit, or that they are applicable to what you're feeling now or what you're anticipating over this next period with the humanitarian OpenStreetMap movement and HOT as an organization. And I guess I just want to finish off by saying two things. One, just reiterating, how powerful it is to hold these tensions, how powerful it is to kind of find a way that reconciles these things that are seemingly irreconcilable. It unlocks an incredible amount of creativity and it unlocks kind of organizations and movements that are transformative, not merely incremental, but transformative. That's my deep belief. But the other thing that I'll say is there can be a tendency to put the holding of those tensions on one person or two people or 10 people. Sometimes it's the founders, sometimes it's the leaders, sometimes it's the the quote unquote old guard who has to hold all of these tensions. And what I've realized in my time is that that's really rickety and has its own challenges. And so as you all move forward in holding these tensions and thinking about this, what I would challenge you all to do is to hold these together. So to really think about as the community and movement grow and you start to feel these tensions, that all of you are sort of embracing this, that everybody who's part of this movement are embracing these tensions and saying, okay, what is the creative way that allows us to hold these two without resolving in one direction or another, that really allows us to unlock the power and the transformative impact of OpenStreetMaps and the humanitarian application of OpenStreetMaps. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for having me. I'm inspired by everything you all do and this movement, and hope to stay connected for a very long time. Take care.
George, thank you very much for those really, I think, not only compelling and inspiring, but really relevant remarks today. With that, guys, we're going to move forward and sort of close out. I have a few remarks I'd like to share with you as well. But before we get to that, if you don't recognize me, it might be because my hair has grown slightly longer and my beard's gotten just a little bit grayer since we last met. And if we haven't had the pleasure to meet before, I'm Tyler, I'm HOT's Executive Director. It's been really great to see and interact with so many of you as part of today's summit. I'd just like to thank a few people as we close out the day today. First of all, our World Bank colleagues who so kindly hosted us for today's summit, and also the SMILE team who were running the event behind the scenes, helping with technical support in the Zoom platform, and who spent many, many late nights at least several late nights working with us to get everything sorted. So thank you very much to the Smile team. What amazing MCs we've also had today. A huge thank you to the entire Summit Working Group and Planning Committee. There's more than 30 volunteers who worked on this event behind the scenes. And this was led by our really wonderful operations team, led by Rachel Van Nies and Dana Galati. If you were involved in any way, I'd like everybody listening today to go maximize your Zoom window, go up to the top right-hand corner and choose gallery view so you can see all the participants. And if you worked as a volunteer for the summit, turn on your video if you're able to, just for a minute, and just wave and say hi to everybody. It'd be great for everyone to see the volunteers and the MCs behind the event today. Thank you, team. Amazing. I'm really fortunate in my role with HOT in that I get to see all the impacts of all of your work and all of our work in person in so many countries. And I was reflecting a bit on that today. Not seeing each other has been really hard. It's been a tough year. I miss you, frankly speaking. It's been hard, but today has been so inspiring. And I'm really hopeful for what's to come in 2021 and really look forward to seeing so many of you in person again. As Mikkel and Kate reflected on earlier, this year marks HOT's 10th anniversary, and it's my own 5th anniversary this year. I joined HOT at that first summit that they talked about. That was, I think, my 3rd day on the job after the Nepal earthquake in 2015. The theme of today's event was the past, present, and future of humanitarian OpenStreetMap. And I want to make a few remarks about the future and where I see us going. What I want to share with you today, it's a statement of intent for HOT within the humanitarian and OpenStreetMap ecosystems. And it's been shaped by many conversations that I've had and colleagues have had with community groups, collaborators, and contributors in the universe in which we exist. But my remarks only represent my own perspective and some of the recent thinking within HOT, the NGO. So please think of it as sort of an early draft and a contribution to a much longer conversation. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge today that HOT's presentation of itself has increasingly highlighted our successes, and there have been many of them, while sometimes smoothing over or not fully acknowledging our challenges and failures. Today's summit featured FailFest sessions for the first time, where some of our colleagues and friends shared learnings from where they didn't necessarily get things right. So what I'd like to talk about is not what we've gotten right, but in the same vein as FailFest sessions, about how we'd like to embrace a stronger culture of feedback and learning, and hope that by doing so, we can achieve great things together over the next 5 years. This year, as you've heard about several times today, we received the phenomenal news. We were selected as one of 8 world-changing ideas by TED's Audacious Project. In 2019, HOT voting members told us they wanted an area home to 1 billion people living in countries experiencing high risk of disaster or high poverty levels added to OpenStreetMap. We took this challenge very seriously, and we pitched to Audacious Project investors the idea of mobilizing 1 million humanitarian OpenStreetMap contributors as a way to achieve this. And after months and months of work and multiple stages of applying and being assessed, several extraordinary philanthropists behind the Audacious Project invested in our community's vision. However, we know that even if these headline ambitions are achieved, we will have failed if there are not also active and sustainable OpenStreetMap ecosystems in many of the 94 countries once the Audacious Project finishes in 2025. The approach over the next 5 years must be community-centered and strive for local sustainability and local power as key outcomes. This is a game changer for HOT and hopefully for the ecosystem in which we exist. The project funding model that Kate and Mikkel talked about and that we've relied upon for really the past 10 years has meant that we've underinvested in longer-term community support and contributions. This can now change, but before it does, we know that some serious self-reflection is also needed. First, we need to recognize what HOT is and what it isn't. 10 years ago, again, as you heard earlier from Mikkel and Kate, the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team could more or less describe all humanitarian-focused OpenStreetMap contributors. The number of people and initiatives were relatively small. The players who were involved were heavily networked. Today, that's no longer true, but we intentionally continue to use the acronym or the term HOT as a catch-all in a really genuine but perhaps naive attempt to be as inclusive as possible. That was a mistake. In conversations over the past months, some people made it clear to us that this can be problematic. When we refer to HOT communities or the wider HOT community, or even users of our tools like Tasking Manager as HOT community members, we can make the mistake of associating groups of people in their work with HOT, even where they themselves haven't chosen that association. We understand now that for those groups, this can feel like HOT taking credit or assimilating. And while this was never our intention, we will stop doing this. We of course welcome all who share in our mission to consider themselves part of the HOT family, but while doing so on their own terms. In fact, in trying to work through this and define what we mean by HOT and community, we came to a realization that maybe it is not our role to do this defining. Groups contributing to OpenStreetMap already define themselves, and that is as it should be, just as many contributors define themselves as part of one or many groups. Maybe our role is to work out what HOT should be in relation to them in order to achieve the ambitions we've articulated through the audacious vision. A friend from OpenStreetMap Africa Network recently told us, communities stop talking to HOT because HOT only talks about HOT. We recognize that while HOT was instrumental in creating and nurturing the space for dialogue and collaboration to happen around humanitarian use of OpenStreetMap, recently we have too often ended up occupying that space. We will now work toward contributing as a valuable and active constituent part of what we recognize is a much larger network and ecosystem. In order to achieve our audacious goals, we know that HOT needs to be part of a movement that champions local people, local knowledge, local devices, and open data to solve local problems. The movement needs to be inclusive, representative, and value must flow across it in multiple directions. The resources that come from the Audacious Prize can be instrumental in supporting this, but only if they enrich the movement as a whole. In any ecosystem, money and resources equal power. The microgrants program is a great example of where HOT has been successful in developing a mechanism to redistribute money from donors and funders to local communities trying to solve local problems. We need to work out how to be much more radical though. One example is putting community support funding decisions in the hands of OpenStreetMap related groups in each region, and supporting the already great work led by local OSM groups in established and emerging local NGOs, in INGOs, and across OpenStreetMap in places like the local chapters working group and the OSMF. We need help figuring out how to best contribute to these initiatives and aims, how to turn HOT into a community amplifier, into a sort of humanitarian OpenStreetMap super spreader, into a vehicle for people who want to save or improve lives, alleviate suffering, and restore human dignity using open data, tools, and knowledge. So what does this all mean, practically speaking? Beyond this statement, we've already started to operationalize what I'm talking about, and I want to mention 3 ways as we close out today. First, you may have noticed that this event is no longer called the HOT Summit, but rather the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Summit, a space and time for all those who care about open data for humanitarian action to come together, share, and learn. We are happy to resource and coordinate the event, but it must serve HOSM, not just HOT. This small step is the start of a process of deoccupation of the humanitarian OpenStreetMap space by HOT. Think mailing lists, working groups, communication channels, and I'd welcome your ideas on other ways that we might be able to do this. For this world-changing movement to map our world to get bigger, we at HOT must create space for others to evolve and lead. Supporting the movement, inspiring it, amplifying it, but not controlling or defining it, and making sure we get out of the way. As one small example of this, we have committed to stop opening new long-term country offices and will support our country office staff in transitioning to fully independent local entities over the course of 2021. Second, we've committed to resourcing 4 regional hubs as part of the Audacious project, moving decision-making and resources away from a remote global team and closer to where we want to support people and communities. How these hubs evolve is something we need help with, particularly from contributors and communities in those regions. Third, we also commit to doing much more of our thinking in public. While it hasn't been through bad intentions, we have gradually stopped documenting our work, thinking, and decisions completely in the open. This leads to a less rich ecosystem, limits our contribution to a commons of open knowledge, and makes it hard for others to have an open dialogue with us. As part of that, we're going to reprioritize channels for constructive feedback, criticism, suggestion, and discussion. We have further work to do on how we welcome and facilitate these conversations, but we've made a start. You can check out a page, hotosm.org/feedback. At the heart of my words today is truly the will to work out what it really means to be a community-centric NGO in this ecosystem. As George pointed out earlier, it's not easy. There's always going to be tensions there. But we truly are trying to do something that's never been done before, a map of our world by and for the people of our world. 1 billion people, 94 countries. We need to think quite ambitiously, even audaciously, as local and international humanitarian and development partners are relying on us for data that can lead to life-changing impact. But as our OpenStreetMap Philippines colleagues suggested, we also need to ask ourselves, audacious for who? How do we transform HOT and make it something that enables people living in areas vulnerable to humanitarian crises or with high levels of poverty to achieve their own audacious goals? So coming back to the future of humanitarian OpenStreetMap, I'll posit today that the future is not HOT. It is all of us here today across hundreds of organizations and groups working to make an impact through data. Just imagine the realm of what we can make possible together if we get our transformation right. Thank you so much for being part of the summit today. It was fantastic for me, and I hope it was for you as well. Take care.
Thank you so much, Tyler, and thank you, George, for those closing remarks. What an amazing end to the summit, and it was a great summit. Many thanks and gratitude to every one of our speakers today. We appreciate your time and commitment, and we look forward to hearing more voices from more places, both at the summit and every day. Another shout out to our sponsors that help enable the summit to happen: Esri, Facebook, Critigen, and Mapbox. And of course, a huge thanks to each and every one of you that has spent some time with us today, whether it's your first day or whether you've been here since day one. Without you, none of what we're working on would be possible. We look forward to continued conversations, partnerships, and learning from everyone. Before signing off, a reminder, the recordings from the summit will be online by the end of the week on the Understanding Risk site for any of you who want to rewatch or missed a talk. We will notify attendees by email when they are up. Goose Chase winner announcements will be announced via social media. And definitely do not forget to check out and apply for the Esri and HOT $5,000 micro grant by January 4th. Please reach out to summit@hotosm.org with any questions, and please keep safe and healthy. And we'll see you all in OSM. We hope to talk to you again soon. Bye.